Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to warmly welcome each of you. I have the privilege and the pleasure to introduce our today's lecturer, Dr. Yoram Hazony, who is the president of the Herzl Institute from Jerusalem. And we will have a short discussion of 45 minutes altogether. I will receive questions in the meantime if you send anything by mobile phone. So wherever I can, I try to be as flexible as possible to build in your questions. And of course, we will also have a questions and answers session at the very end of the hour. So the last 10-15 minutes will be devoted to your personal questions. I hope that we can cover quite many issues. So I would refrain from a longer introduction. And I'd like to ask about your personal experience of Europe, the intellectual landscape of Europe. I understand you just came from Stockholm, and now you are in Budapest. How do you see, how would you assess the current intellectual landscape of Europe seen from the outside?
Well, Europe in a certain, look, people like to distinguish European culture from American culture. I know there are many good reasons for it, but I think the most prominent characteristic of European culture in these days is very similar to American culture, which is that after World War II, liberalism, by which I mean a worldview that emphasizes individual freedom, individual liberties and equality above everything else. Liberalism became the dominant civilization, the dominant political theory in all of these countries, America and Europe, and other democratic nations. And that dominance has been mostly unchallenged in most countries in Europe and America since that time. And in the last few years, we've been seeing what looks like the beginning of a change. First, most dramatically, after Brexit and Trump, it began to look like many democratic countries were moving in the direction of nationalism or a nationalist conservatism, which is something that was unfamiliar. It has forerunners. So I would say there's a dramatic break after 2016 in which for the first time you see Hungarians can look at countries like America and Britain, Italy, and of course Israel, India, Brazil, and see political formations, the advance of a political theory and political parties, which look a little bit like Hungarian political party, like Fidesz or other Eastern European national conservative parties. So I would welcome this. I see this as very positive. I think that liberalism has had some achievements, but it's been in many ways very destructive. And the return to the idea of the nation and the idea of public religion and the traditions of each people is something I think remarkable and crucial. I'll just point to one other thing that I think you need to pay attention to, which is that in 2020, liberalism in the United States as the dominant hegemonic political idea largely collapsed. So I don't know if you can see it from here, that liberal institutions like the New York Times or Princeton University, certainly Hollywood and many others shifted in a direction that I would say is really neo-Marxist. It's a cultural revolution which is no longer liberal. It no longer emphasizes just the freedom of the individual, but is actually attempting in a much more active way to purposely destroy and overthrow the traditions of Western countries. So I'm talking about God and Scripture, the nation, the family, the congregation, even the difference between man and woman. So that's happening mostly in English-speaking countries now, but it will get here too. It's reaching everywhere through the university system. And so when I look at Europe, in part, I actually see something hopeful, that there do appear to be European countries that are more attached, more willing to fight for their national independence, their national traditions, than many Americans. And so we're in this odd situation in which a small country like Hungary or a small country like Israel can be inspiring to many conservatives in America who say, well, maybe we have something to learn from them.
What made liberalism so successful in your understanding? And you argue that classical liberalism, how it actually was built on universal values, is very dangerous, very harmful to these traditional institutions. Why do you regard so?
Well, let me begin with the harm. Liberalism is not mistaken in describing the way that economics work. When you look at an economy is based on individuals or companies owned by individuals trading products, producing products, buying and selling, and it's a way for human beings to be extremely productive and extremely successful in certain narrow areas. But the problem, and this is something that prominent conservative thinkers have been saying for many, many decades, Russell Kirk, Irving Kristol, Roger Scruton, all of these are thinkers who have pointed out that the problem with liberalism is that when it leaves the economic sphere and begins to replace the family, the nation, the congregation, that's where it does damage. Now, why does this happen? Because think about it. If a young man wants to marry a young woman and they decide to get married, and what kind of a relationship are they constructing? Is it a completely free relationship? Is it like exchange in the market? If that were true, then the relationship between me and my wife. My wife is sitting back there. That's Yael. She and I have had 9 children, and now we have just had our 2nd and 3rd grandchildren together. And you should ask yourself, that deserves applause. And she put up with me for all this time. That also deserves applause. But if we're going to get married at the age of 20 or 22, and then we're going to be married for for the rest of our lives, for 50, 60, 70 years, however much time God gives us together, what kind of thoughts, what kind of framework do I need in order to understand my relationship in this marriage? Well, some people will say, if you read Ayn Rand, she'll say it's just like the market. As long as Yael seems to be the best for me and I seem to be the best for her, then we should stay together. But as soon as somebody better comes along, then Ayn Rand's novels say that I should switch to somebody better. Because why should I spend time with someone who's not the best possible person for me? Now you can see that's a liberal perspective. It's not a conservative perspective. A conservative says, no, the most important relationships that we have are the ones that when you go into crisis, when you go into pain, when it really hurts and becomes really difficult, then you say, no, I'm staying here. Right? That's the opposite of the market. In the market, when you don't like your boss becomes annoying to you and you don't like your job, you quit your job and you leave and you go find a better job. But we don't do that in a marriage. In a marriage, we say, no, we are building something that is very difficult to build. It requires a lifetime to build it. It requires, and that lifetime involves good parts and bad parts, periods of great excitement and success, and periods of extreme pain. And people don't tell you this about a marriage, that every marriage that succeeds succeeds because, not because there's no pain, but because there is pain, and the husband and the wife say, this is worth doing in spite of the pain. We're going to find a way through the pain. The same thing is true for raising children. Many of you don't seem to be married, but you're all children, and you know how much pain you cause your parents, or maybe you don't know. Maybe you think they only cause pain to you. But a relationship between parents and children, or between grandparents and their grandchildren, is a permanent relationship. It never goes away. The responsibilities never go away. It's not like the market. The same thing is true with a nation. A nation is much more like a family than it is like a free market. Sometimes they're good people running your country, sometimes they're evil people running your country, but it's still your country. Sometimes your traditions are being properly interpreted to produce beautiful things, and sometimes they're being badly interpreted by people who don't really understand, and they're doing much harm. But it's still your nation, and you don't run away and say, no, I'm going to find some other nation because today my nation is going in the wrong direction. So the market, which is the best way for us to be creative and productive economically, if you adopt this principle of well, I'll just do whatever feels best at the moment that it feels best, which that is the principle of the market. Whatever is in my interest now, not what's in my interest 30 years from now or 50 years from now, or in the interests of my grandchildren. If we adopt the principle of the market into the family and into the relationship between citizens in the nation, then it destroys them. It turns the family into a non-family. It turns the nation into a non-nation. And the family and the nation cease to exist. And that is, in fact, what we've been watching, especially in the last 30, 40 years, is the family and the nation and the religious congregation. All of these institutions are ceasing to exist. And that means that we become the kind of people who think the only thing that I need is to do whatever feels good to me at a moment. I don't owe anything to past generations or to future generations.
If liberalism is so harmful to traditional institutions, be it family or nation, what made it so successful in political terms and also at the level of political thought?
Well, I would say two things. First, it's successful economically. It is true that in many times and places, if you have too much regulation and too much interference of the government in operating the market, it is true that that does in fact prevent new people from taking the initiative and creating new economic institutions, new companies which provide better services at lower costs. And so the liberal view of the economy, it gives power. It gives a great deal of power to countries that adopt it. If they adopt it and they stick to it, the economy grows quickly. And a quickly growing economy means that as long as it remains within bounds, a quickly growing economy means that your nation becomes more powerful, that if, God forbid, you need to fight a war, you have more resources. You can buy better weapons. You can build better schools and better universities and better hospitals. There are many good things about a flourishing economy, and liberalism does show us in many respects how to have a flourishing economy. So that's one reason why liberalism is successful, is because it contains some truth just in certain areas. But there's another, probably more important reason, which is that during the Second World War, the nations of Europe and the nations of the world were forced to contend with a racial imperialism, which was the theory of the Nazi Party, and that racial imperialism, it left no room for independent nations, it left no room for religion, and it left no room for the individual, for individual freedom. It also governed the economy tightly. It left no room for the market. And that was a trauma. Fighting the Second World War against the Germans and the Japanese, that was not only a trauma for you in Hungary living here. It was a trauma for most of the nations in the world that were drawn into this, but especially for the United States and Britain. And these powerful countries, the United States and Britain, and many European leaders as well, came out of the Second World War with a determination that this was never going to happen again. Really, we should be talking about both the First and the Second World War. These two wars destroyed the world that we had known, and American leaders and British leaders and those leaders in France and Germany as well came out with this determination: we're going to prevent this. We're never going to have this again. And obviously, that's a noble aim, to never have it again. But the way that they decided that they would avoid ever having the First or the Second World War or anything like it again, or the Holocaust, the way they decided was, they said, look, what's the problem with the Germans? The problem with German Nazism is that they didn't treat people equally, that they didn't say Jews are equal to other Germans. And they didn't say Poles should be treated the same way as Germans or Hungarians. That was their theory, that equality and individual liberty, if you hold on to them tight enough, if you impose them hard enough, then they will eliminate all fascism, all communism, all imperialism from the world. That was it was a utopian theory. And it did some good things. You know, in the name of liberalism, the Americans stopped persecuting the blacks in the South in the United States, which was an appalling history of genuine persecution causing real suffering. And the Americans came back from Europe after World War II, and they said, we fought the race imperialists in Europe. Now we're not going to have race laws in our country. We're going to eliminate them. And I say that was the right thing to do. But the wrong thing to do was to say, because Nazis didn't treat Jews and Germans equally, or because in the American South the Americans didn't treat blacks and whites equally, therefore all of political theory comes down to everyone needs to be treated equally. And so they go from there to saying not just blacks and whites should be treated equally in all things, but also men and women need to be treated equally in all things. And Christians and Jews and atheists need to be treated equally in all things. And people who are married, divorced, never married, need to be treated equally in all things. And people who are raising families and people who refuse to raise families, they need to be treated equally in all things. And you keep going. And the further you go into this thinking, the more insane it becomes. Seriously, it just becomes crazier and crazier. Like what begins as, you know, a few repairs that maybe could be moral and helpful ends up being a revolutionary idea that rearranges the relationships among people all through the society. So what's happening is we see people saying all over America and Europe, people saying, you're a conservative, you don't want perfect equality between men and women, or between Christians and Jews and atheists, or between people who have families and people who don't. You don't want perfect equality in every situation? Then you're like a Nazi. You're like the fascists. This is the trauma. They can't stand any degree of inequality, no matter how sensible it is. They can't stand it because inequality means you're a Nazi. Okay, and that's the power of liberalism over Western countries, is that whenever you say something against equality and individual rights of any kind, then the trauma kicks in and you're immediately treated as though you're a Nazi. But this worldview doesn't work. You cannot treat men and women equally in every single thing. You can't do it. Even if you look at sports. You see how crazy the Americans are. They're coming to think that there should be no women's athletic competitions that are just for women, but men who say that they feel that they're women, they're going to participate too. You can't find your way out of this. There is no way to have a political theory that's only based on freedom and equality. We have traditions. We have traditions based on the Bible and based on religion and our national traditions. And these traditions, they tell us where it makes sense to give liberty and where it makes sense not to, where it makes sense to give equality and where it makes sense not to. And if you throw out those traditions, you throw out everything that our society is built on, and only destruction comes.
Politicians on the right tend to differentiate between classical liberalism on the one hand and progressive liberalism on the other. May I interpret your previous words that you support this proposition? Do you accept that also at intellectual level you can make this differentiation? And if yes, what is the origin of these two different approaches?
You know, I would make the division somewhat different. Look, there is a difference between left liberalism and right liberalism. This is a distinction that Patrick Deneen makes in his book. And there is a distinction. There's a distinction between people who say freedom and equality is primarily in the sphere of social behavior and sexual behavior. So there is a liberalism that says, you know, the most important thing is that we have freedom from religion or marriage customs or living our personal lives in a certain way. And right liberals say that it's the economic freedom that's the most important thing. But I think that Patrick is right, that if we take a step back and we look at the last 70 years in America and Europe, that you know, the competition between the left liberals and the right liberals is actually a very narrow competition. I mean, in the end, we get both left liberalism and right liberalism. We get both the deregulation in the economic sphere and deregulation in the social sphere. And so I think it's fair to just look at the whole thing and say it's liberalism. Now, that's different from what Americans today call progressive or woke. Progressive or woke ideology is, as I said before, I mean, it really is a Marxist. It's a descendant of Marxism, because instead of saying the main thing is freedom and equality, that's liberalism, the woke ideology says the main thing is oppressor and oppressed. The main thing is figuring out who has power in this country. And whoever has power in this country is the oppressor. And whoever doesn't have power in this country is the oppressed. That's a Marxist framework. That's a revolutionary framework whose goal is to eliminate the oppressor. Because liberals don't think so much in terms of eliminating the oppressor. I mean, if they see that there's inequality, then they want there to be equality. But Marxists say, what are you talking about? Of course there's equality. There's equality because there's an elite, and the elite is the oppressors, and we have to destroy them. And on the American left today, it's actually become very difficult to distinguish between the left liberals and the Marxists. But it is something very different. So, look, I think the easiest way to understand the political landscape that all of us face is there is such a thing as a liberal. It's somebody who does not believe in tradition. They believe freedom will solve, individual liberty will solve all the problems in the world, pretty much. And there's such a thing as a Marxist. And a Marxist is someone who focuses on the ruling class or the elites, and they say, these people are evil, they have to be destroyed. Both of these forces are anti-conservative. Both of them are hostile to the idea that we inherit from our parents and our great-grandparents and our great-great-great-grandparents, that we inherit scriptures that are wise and true, that we inherit traditions that give us strength and give us direction and save us from all of these devastating social ills. Both liberals and Marxists are opposed to this. Now, today, the Marxist cultural revolution is driving some liberals to rethink. That's a very hopeful thing. You know, not a lot of things that we're seeing are not so hopeful. This is a hopeful thing, that the cultural Marxism is so crazy with its 50 different genders and its insistence that people be kicked out of social life for saying the wrong word. They're so crazy that there's a chance that what we're seeing is that some of the liberals are becoming anti-Marxist liberals. And as they become anti-Marxist liberals, they also look around and they say, you know, I can't help noticing that the Marxists are trying to destroy me, but the conservatives and the nationalists, they're actually willing to talk. And some anti-Marxist liberals, they come to our conferences and they say, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a nationalist, but I've come to talk. And that's a hopeful sign. That means that there's a possibility of a broader alliance. That doesn't mean that we should become liberals. We should definitely not become liberals. Very bad idea. No, don't tell anybody I said become liberals. But we conservatives, our job is to deepen our connection and our understanding of our national and religious traditions and to restore them to public life. The liberals' job is to worry about freedom. Those liberals who can see clearly that the Marxists are bringing tyranny, if they're willing to work with us, then we have to work with them. But we have to keep that distinction. A liberal is not a conservative. We can work together. We don't have to give in to their theories. Right? Let's focus on our theories. The public life of the nation has a job. It's not just freedom. It's not only freedom. Even if what you want to do is preserve national freedom, but also individual freedom, you want to preserve it, you have to have traditions. That's our job.
In your previous book on conservative democracy, you tried to offer an alternative, both in terms of political regime and intellectual approach to liberal democracy. What was your recipe? What would you like to offer where you can harmonize certain values, be it on the individual side, like individual liberties, limits to government, and on the traditional side, traditional institutions?
Well, the first thing is I should say something about this term, liberal democracy. Today, because the liberals control the universities and the media, or did until they were challenged from the left, for many, many years, the expression liberal democracy was turned into, the expression itself is very recent. It was invented in the 1920s or 30s. It didn't become popular anywhere until the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It doesn't become dominant until the 1980s and 1990s. So it's a new term. And liberals like to act as though it's an ancient term. They like to act as though, the American Revolution was a revolution for liberal democracy. And as soon as they tell you that, as soon as you agree, the American Revolution or the Glorious Revolution in England or the French Revolution, whatever, as soon as they tell you, for hundreds of years we've stood for liberal democracy, and you say, oh, okay, I didn't know that, but that sounds okay. As soon as you say that, then they say, aha, so you're a liberal. And you say, well, I guess so, because I support liberal democracy. And they say, aha, so you oppose anybody who would do anything that would in any way prevent perfect equality and freedom for the individuals, and then you're trapped. Okay, that's the trap. So this essay, I wrote an essay called Conservative Democracy. And conservative democracies are countries like Hungary today or Israel today, and also like Britain. If you notice that Britain still has a king and queen, Britain still has an established church. It's a very liberal society, but it's conservative in very many important ways. Even America was a conservative democracy, I would say, until Eisenhower, until the 1950s. I think that the shift from a country that is fundamentally a Christian country, fundamentally has a public life that's based on Christianity, the traditional law, which in America is the common law, the traditional language, which is English, the traditional family structure, traditional morals. All of these things still exist in America as the dominant culture until the 1950s. Okay, in the 1960s, there's the shift towards liberalism. And then in the 1980s, people start to say, oh, well, we're a liberal democracy. That's the only legitimate form of government in the history of the world. And of course, America's been that for 200 years. It's nonsense. It's not true. There's no truth to this. The reason people are so excited about trying to get you to use the term liberal democracy is because they say, look, there's really only three main ways to approach politics. There's communism. there's Nazism or fascism, and there's liberal democracy. You don't want to be a communist? You don't want to be a Nazi? So liberal democracy, that's the answer. You must be a liberal Democrat. What they don't notice, what they don't tell you, is that Nazism is a modern revolutionary movement, and liberalism is a modern revolutionary movement, and communism is a modern revolutionary movement. And this way of thinking of politics eliminates any need to ask, is there anything to learn from the Bible? Is there anything to learn from Christianity or Judaism? Is there anything to learn from our ancestors here in Hungary? It's all eliminated the moment you say fascism, liberal democracy, and communism. And so we have to say something else. We have to say, no, I'm sorry, sir, you're mistaken. There aren't only three possibilities, because there's at least a fourth possibility, which is a conservative democracy, which is a country like Hungary, a country that is interested in maintaining the freedom of individuals, but the public life of the country is going to be traditional. It's going to be based on our heritage, on our religion, on our ancestors, on their great achievements. I'm not saying that everything that our ancestors did was perfect. There's always the possibility to repair something. Conservatives believe in repairing things. But the thrust is our nation is going to be sustainable. It's existed, let's say, for 1,000 years here in Hungary. At least for 1,000 years, there's been a Hungarian nation. God willing, there'll be another 1,000 years and another after that. But if that's what we want, then we have to ask, what makes a nation sustainable? What makes a people sustainable? Like the question I asked before, what makes a marriage sustainable? It's the same. The moment that you ask, what do I need to do for my values, my way of life to continue into the future, then you're not a liberal anymore. Because now you're asking the conservative question. You're saying, what do I need to bring down from the past and give to my children? If you're asking that question, then you're a conservative. You're not any of these modern revolutionary theories.
Why was the term Republican government replaced by liberal democracy in the US, in your view?
Well, Republican government was the main way that Americans spoke about their own country up until, I think, up until the 1960s. Certainly before World War II, going back to the American Declaration of Independence, they didn't call themselves democracy and they didn't call themselves liberal. They called themselves a Republican government. And what they meant by this was that, on the one hand, the Americans, they did have a revolution. They had a king, and they decided they didn't want a king. They were attached to British nobility, but in America there was no nobility, so they said, that's it, we're something different. We don't have a king and we don't have nobility. By the way, in Britain they didn't have slaves either, and the Americans did have slaves, and that's another terrible story. But the main thrust of republicanism in the United States was to say, we're not a revolutionary democracy. We're not trying to create absolute elimination of religion from public life. We're not trying to create absolute equality and perfect freedom. We're not utopians. What the Americans, in the first 150 years of their republic, what they were trying to do was to remove the king, but leave Christianity, which in most places in the United States there was a public Christianity, which was actually, to one degree or another, it was part of the government. Some states had official Christian churches, established churches in the United States, and other states didn't have established churches, but they had established religion. They had rules that you had to be a Christian in order to hold office, or you had to be a Christian or a Jew, but you couldn't be an atheist. And the stores had to be closed on the Sabbaths, and people could be arrested for public obscenity, that is, for behaving in immodest and improper ways in public. They had blasphemy laws, meaning that you, in public, you're expected to speak with respect of God. If you don't want to speak respectfully of God, then they send you to prison for a week to think about it. I'm not saying whether that's good or not. I'm just saying that's what America was for its first 150 years. It was a publicly Christian country which believed in individual liberty, but did not think that individual liberty replaces everything else in society. That comes only after World War II. So I see the term Republican government is a term that the Americans invented to say we're not monarchists anymore, but we're still conservatives. We still perpetuate the values and religion and the common law and the traditions of our ancestors, but we don't have a king. We're going to try to rule ourselves through our institutions, which, by the way, are copied largely from the English Parliament. So that's it. That word is gone. Most Americans never use it, never hear it. And the term liberal democracy is everywhere. I proposed conservative democracy just because it directly argues against liberal democracy. It says, you're wrong. You don't have to be a liberal in order to live in a country where people vote and have elections.
How do you see the role of religion and the churches, especially in the light of belonging it to, pushing it into the private sector, private sphere in the US? And I remember also once you mentioned in one of your lectures that you can accept conservatives who are not believers. How do you see, what can a conservative, be it believer or non-believer, do to reestablish Christian values?
Well, let me say, I'm sorry to bore you with all this American history, but because it is so misunderstood, and then it's used by people all over Europe in order to claim, look, the Americans think this way. Separation of church and state is not part of the American founding. It was not advocated by anyone who was involved in framing the American Constitution. Years later, when Jefferson is president, he writes a letter advocating separation of church and state, but it's not part of American government policy to separate, to remove all religion from the public life of the state until it begins in the 1940s. It's a reaction to World War II, like we discussed before. It's part of the trauma of World War II. The Germans treated Jews badly, so we should separate. So there should be no religious considerations in public life. It's that kind of reaction. In the United States, the first time that the Supreme Court intervenes to make unconstitutional anything on the grounds of separation of church and state throughout the country in the United States, the first time is 1947, when the Supreme Court says separation of church and state has always been a value here, which wasn't true because it was invented in 1947, but that's what they say. It's always been a value, and now we're going to ban religious teaching in government schools. We're going to eliminate it. And the kinds of teaching that they were eliminating, it's astonishing to see what they eliminated. In the Chicago schools the Chicago schools where it was made illegal in 1947 to teach religion, they had they brought in a Catholic priest and a Protestant minister and a Jewish rabbi. They gave the students a choice. You can go to any of the three to learn something about the religions that are important in our country and in our city. And if you didn't want to go to one of those classes, you could say, my beliefs are different out of conscience. I don't want any of them, and you didn't have to go. And today we look at this. It's so moderate. It's so willing to open itself up to to different traditions and different ways of thinking, and to allow people who are objecting because of conscience to not participate. That's what the American court struck down and said, no, we can't have any of this because we have separation of church and state. And by the 1960s, they had eliminated all prayer from schools throughout the United States, through the public schools, and they had eliminated any instruction in Bible so that the students could know something about their religious heritage. It takes 2 generations. We did this experiment. It takes 2 generations from the time you ban God and prayer and Bible from the schools. From the time that happens, it takes 2 generations until people can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. I'm sorry to be so provocative, but this is what happened. So we I think that what we need to do, to go to the practical question, is first the liberals tell us that any time that Christianity is established somewhere as the public life of a country, like in Hungary, it's oppressing the minorities. Okay, so here I am. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I'm telling you that's not oppressing anyone. Here in Hungary, this is what the Jews who live here tell me. Right? I'm repeating what I'm told by the Jews here in Budapest. Here in Budapest, they say the government supports Judaism. It supports Jewish schools. It supports Jewish ritual baths, Jewish cemeteries. There's no ban on kosher slaughter. There's no ban on circumcision. Jews can lead a free, dignified life here. And also, I walk down the street wearing my Jewish head covering, and I've never once had anyone stop me on the street and say what they say in Paris or in London when you walk around, dirty Jew. I'm serious. In Paris and London, I experience it. Here in Budapest, I don't. The Jews in Budapest are respected and honored by the government. I'm not saying that there is no mistakes. I'm not saying that there aren't things that couldn't be improved, but as a general matter, the Jews here in Hungary are respected and honored by the government. And there's no contradiction between having a Christian nation with a Christian majority, which honors Jews and honors other minorities. And in fact, my proposal is something like this, that anywhere where there's 80% of the public sees itself, I'm not asking about whether they go to church. I'm asking whether they see themselves as part of a Christian heritage. In a place like that, there should be honor and respect to the Christian religion. It should appear in public. Bible and prayer should be available. If someone doesn't want to participate, then they don't have to. If they're Jewish and they have a different way, as long as it's honorable and respectful, it's all to the good. Why am I saying this as an Orthodox Jew? Because what we've learned is that the liberals and the Marxists, if you just give them a few decades, they will come to the point where they make it impossible to be a Christian, where they make it impossible to be an Orthodox Jew. Jews are much more likely today to get a fair, respectful, honored place in society from Christians than they are from these revolutionaries. All right, so I'm not saying I think that some kind of discussion needs to be had. We've begun doing it at our national conservatism conferences. A discussion needs to be had between the Christian majority and minorities about what can be done. But I don't see any reason why a 2% minority or a 5% minority or a 10% minority has to clear the public space and eliminate it from Christianity in a country where that's the inheritance. I don't see any reason for that. It doesn't make any sense. It's unjust, it's unfair, it's reckless, and it doesn't work.
What happened to Christianity in the US and partly also true in Western Europe seems very similar to what we are experiencing within the European Union happening to the nation state. How do you see this conflict? How can it be resolved?
I do not think that this conflict is going to be resolved. I mean, I think it's going to be won by one side or the other. There are many, look, there are many kinds of conflict that can, with time, reach some kind of a compromise that is acceptable to both sides. But here, when we're talking about whether the government of Poland, whether the courts in Poland, whether they have the right to ultimately make a decision for the Polish people about how Poles live. That's the issue between Poland and the European Union. There's a direct struggle between Poles who want their country to be independent, which means they make their own decisions, they chart their own course, and of course, God judges all of us. But the fact that God judges all the nations does not mean that God is unhappy with Poland for being independent. What we see in the EU, in Brussels, and many of the German and French, especially ideologues of European Union, is really not much more. I mean, I know that they think they're bringing peace and prosperity to mankind with their borderless utopia. But what they're really doing is they're saying, you in Poland and Hungary, you in Italy and Britain, we're going to oppress you until you're good liberals. We're going to force you until you're good liberals. You can't have Polish courts overruling European courts because they might not be good liberals. We're going to force you. You can't have Italian voters choosing who their finance minister is. We'll impose a finance minister from Brussels. All right, so there is no compromise here. Either your nation is independent, which means that your parliament, your government, your courts decide what laws ultimately there are in Hungary, or you become a protectorate of a European empire, which will be a German empire, just because they're the strongest. Maybe a German and French empire. It's not going to become a Hungarian empire. I don't recommend the Hungarian empire either, but no, I keep meeting these strange people who tell me, when we Hungarians had empire, those were the good old days. And look, I have a different proposal. Read your Bible, read your Old Testament, pay attention to this. God, creator of heaven and earth, gives the law to Moses, and Moses believes, and I believe, and many Christians have believed that the law is given to all mankind. The law is not only given, to the Jews. The law is given to the Jews, but the law is for all mankind. Okay, so that makes sense. But then why does God command Moses, there are borders to your country, you're not allowed to go and conquer the neighbors? Why does he say that? All the other gods in the ancient Middle East, the gods of the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Persians, all the other gods said the opposite. They said, go out, O king of Assyria, and conquer the four corners of the earth and bring peace and prosperity. Suppress the violence in the earth. But our God doesn't say that. God, creator of heaven and earth, doesn't say that to Moses. He says, I gave you the law. Here's your border. That law is for these borders. The other peoples, when they decide that they want to learn from you about the law, they'll come to Jerusalem and they'll learn about it. You do not have a right to go and conquer all the other nations and enforce your idea of what God thinks on them. Even Moses, the greatest of the prophets, is not thought to be great enough to rule the world and impose justice according to Jewish laws on the entire planet. That's our scripture. Our scripture is different from these theories of world universal empire. Our scripture says, leave the other peoples alone. Work on yourself. Make sure that your relationship with God is right. That's a good model, I think. I think it's a good model. I think it's a good model for Hungary. And it makes me angry. It really does. It's really upsetting that all of these Europeans, they think that they're doing good and right by dictating to Hungary, by eliminating the sovereignty and independence of Hungary because they know what's best. I say there has to be a decision one way or another. Now, I'm not saying don't cooperate with your neighbors. Hungary has common military interests with its neighbors, many common economic interests. There's all sorts of ways in which cooperation and even international, formal international organizations can be useful as long as they're between independent nations that maintain their independence. But European courts deciding your laws, no. European legislature or Council of Europe deciding who immigrates to Hungary, you say no. The European currency, they're deciding what is the economic advantage of Hungarians by looking at all of Europe. You say no. Demand your independence. You're a free people. God bless you.
You are working on a new book on conservatism. Is it possible to reveal some of the bottom lines of your new work?
Right. Well, I should advertise my last book exists in Hungarian, The Virtue of Nationalism. I hope the next book will also be in Hungarian. The next book is called Conservatism, A Rediscovery. And it's a much more personal book. And it's about the following question. We're talking very generally here about liberal versus conservative societies, constitutions, traditions. These are very, very abstract terms. But in reality, ultimately, in the end, what really determines what happens is whether you personally are a conservative person, whether you personally lead a conservative life. And I know many young people in many different countries who they say, look, I'm conservative. I believe in, I believe in the traditional way of life. I think you're right. I believe in the traditional family. They say these things, and maybe they're involved in trying to pass laws, to support the traditional family and the policies and theories. But then when the Sabbath comes, they go to the beach, or they go to the mountains. The Sabbath is meaningless to them. Now, this may be many people in Hungary as well, that the traditions of your ancestors, well, that's good when we're waving the flag and maybe there's some public prayers. But for me personally, I want to live as a liberal. For me personally, in my life, I want it to be freedom, freedom, freedom all the time. Whatever I feel like doing, I'll do it all the time. And what the next book is about is look, this doesn't work for individuals either. It doesn't work for individuals. Human beings are built to need loyalty. They're built to need the love of their family and the love of their congregation and the love of their nation. They're built to need it. And when you do without that, and you just say, oh, it's the Sabbath, I'll go to the beach. I'm sorry if I'm insulted. There's no beach in Hungary. Where do you go?
We have lakesides.
What? Lakeside. I'll go to the lakeside. Okay, so there's a beach. Okay, just checking. So I'll go to the beach. It's the Sabbath. I'll go to the beach. I don't know about God. What would I do if I went to church? What would I do there? It would be boring or alienating or annoying. And I'm not telling you it's not boring or alienating or annoying. This is part of being ignorant about your own tradition, is that you don't know what it's supposed to do for you. Okay, you don't see the picture of how you personally, getting married at a young age, having children at a young age, how becoming part of a congregation. A congregation is not just your faith. Like what doctrines do you believe in? A congregation is a large family. It's an alliance of families. When you go to the congregation, if it's a living congregation that's handing down real traditions, you meet older people. You see how marriages actually work, how parenting and grandparenting, you see how it actually works. And you begin to soak up the knowledge and the wisdom of what it means to be a conservative person. And going to church is just part of it. Studying the Bible is just part of it. It's a way of life that protects you, and it protects you, but it also gives you whole new kinds of freedom that you can't even imagine when all you're doing is going to the beach. So that's what the book is about. It's about being a conservative person, marrying someone from your own faith, going and joining a congregation where you can become a young husband and wife that learn from the older members what it means to have a family and what it means to be part of a nation. It's still happening, but if you don't have a congregation that's handing this down, then you're probably cut off from it, even if your parents are kind of conservative. So that's it. That's the book.
It's also about the balance between freedom and responsibility. And so far you had the freedom to listen to us. Now you have the responsibility to ask questions. Any questions from the floor? Yes, please.
So my question is that you were talking about conservatism and that what conservative values are still in the Western cultures and Western societies. And I'd like to ask you that how can Western cultures get back to normality when we can see that a majority of Republican voters in the United States are in support of same-sex marriage, and that you mentioned the government of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom's government is full of rainbows and LGBTQ propaganda. So how can we actually go back to these traditional values, and how can conservatism win back its place in Western cultures?
Okay, great question. Is it okay if I stand up? Will that? All right. I just need to stretch my legs a little bit. I've spent a lot of time on airplanes recently. Look, it's a great question. I just came from a conference of conservative students in Sweden, and I've never been to Sweden before. We were there discussing these same subjects, and Sweden is a country where my hosts tell me that even at a conservative student meeting, they believe that if they began the meeting with a little tiny prayer, just asking God's assistance to help them in their struggles, their personal and their national struggles, they think that even the smallest acknowledgement of God in a conservative students meeting, they say, well, you'd lose half the students. Okay, now I don't know if it's true that they lose half the students. That's an interesting question. But I know that they believe that. That's what they think. And in other words, it's a whole nation in which the conservative minority is so small and feels itself so weak that they feel that they can't even take the simplest step in their own meetings to connect with their inheritance. Okay, so there are many places like this in Western countries. They've been ravaged by liberalism, they've been ravaged by communism, and now there's not so much left. Okay, so I'm proposing two different things. First of all, I'm proposing in the public sphere, that instead of accepting liberal separation of church and state, instead of accepting that you say, look, we don't want a liberal country. We've seen liberal internationalism. We've seen liberal democracy. We don't want to go there. We know that in the end it collapses into Marxism. We see what's happening in America. We don't want to become America. So if you don't want to become America, then you have to fill the public space with something other than liberal democracy. And I'm proposing a step that I think a majority in many countries, or at least in many regions, in many cities, there's still a majority that supports it. And that is Christian democracy. Not the weak, the weak thing that is called Christian democracy in many places in Europe today. I'm talking about actual Christian democracy. You don't need a democracy that is liberal in its fundamental values. You need a democracy that is traditional and Christian and national in its fundamental values. So that's the first proposal, is this does not require you to change your personal life. This requires you to build an alliance with people who can see where America and Britain have gone. You can see it with your own eyes, and you don't want to go there, so you say, enough, enough, not liberal democracy, conservative democracy. And that means that the dominant culture in this country is going to be Christian. Okay? That's one proposal. And there are many places where that could be a majority decision. And a second proposal is about you yourself. That if you think that you're going to be able to solve these problems without you personally changing your life, you don't understand how these things work. When you change your life, you affect everyone around you. When you go to church, you affect everyone around you. All of your friends know that they suddenly understand, oh my gosh, what's happening here? You don't yet have to believe in God to go to church. You just have to believe that you want something different from what's taking place in America and Britain. Make the right friends. This is straight out of the Talmud. If you want to be a wise person, the rabbis say, spend your time with wise people. If you want to be a pious person, spend your time with pious people. If you want to be a traditional person, spend your time with traditional people. Do what they do. You don't know how far it's going to go. You don't know what you can learn if you take the first step. What you do know is that if you don't take the first step, then you are part of the problem. Then you yourself are continuing. You say conservative democracy, you say tradition, but you yourself are part of the problem. And that is something that you have entirely within your power to fix tomorrow.
Other questions? Then just very last personal question, okay? You have been well known, recognized now. How is it when your words carry a special weight? We could see what happened to the advocates of liberal democracy, what their role, what their influence was about. How do you see your own role?
My own role? Yes. My own role. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. My role, well, look, my wife and I became observant Orthodox Jews in college. We met in college when we were 18, 19, and together we did what it is I'm proposing that other people do. We found a congregation. We began keeping the Sabbath. We began keeping the dietary laws, and then we moved to Israel. And we found communities that we wanted to be part of there, and we raised a large family, and thank God, still growing. And we did it. We came from a non-traditional society, and we entered into a traditional society, and we found those people who wanted us and valued us, and we became, we let them teach us, and then we became teachers, and now we're teachers, and that's our role. That's my role, is to do the best to praise God and to teach Bible and tradition wherever people want to hear me. It's really that's what I do. And I would say that at a certain point, your life isn't up to you. Your life is, as religious people say, your life is in God's hands. I mean, you can make decisions, but in the end, you don't really decide what happens. And originally, I thought I was going to start a conservative university. I spent 20 years on it. I did all sorts of good and interesting things, but the university was taken over by, it exists in Jerusalem, but it was taken over by the left. And I learned many things from that. And when I left my institution after 20 years, kind of crushed and ruined and devastated about, that this had happened. Some Christian friends who have a very, very important foundation in the United States said, you know what, can you teach Jewish theology? And I said, can I teach what? Jewish theology. And they said, yeah, can you teach the theology of the Bible? Because we Christians, this is very interesting, they said, we Christians, we know how to teach the gospel, we know how to teach the New Testament, but liberalism and society today are focused on attacking the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is the most politically incorrect book in the world. The Old Testament is, the Hebrew Bible, it's all about nations and particular families and God loving the particular individuals and a certain land and all of these things that just don't sound good to liberals. That's even before you get to family life and homosexuality and all of the other issues on which the Bible is politically incorrect. And these Christians came and this is a conversation that I had with Christian leadership in many countries and many different denominations. They said, we think that we could really use help with the Old Testament. I know how to teach the gospel, but I don't know how to teach the Old Testament. Can you Jews help us with teaching the Old Testament? And I said, look, I don't know much about the New Testament, but if you want me to teach about the Old Testament, I'll do it. And I did it. And we ran programs teaching interdenominational Christians from different backgrounds as well as Jews biblical theology for 10 years. And in my whole life, I never thought I would be a theologian. I never thought that I would teach something like that. I never thought I could have an opinion that anybody would care about. And then it turned out that that wasn't true, that people read things that I'd written. They said, can you do this? And I said, okay, this is from God. If God wants me to, he kicks me out of my institution, leaves me without a way of making a living, and then these people come from the other side of the planet and they ask, can you teach theology? So maybe he's trying to tell me something. And I did it. And that was more than a decade ago. And a few years ago, something similar happened with nationalism. The whole time I'm describing, my wife and I were concerned with the Jewish people, mostly. We were concerned with Israel and its future. And then along comes Brexit and Donald Trump, and all of a sudden people all over America and Europe are interested to hear about Israeli nationalism. What does an Israeli have to say about nationalism? And we go back to this. In my whole life, I never thought that I'd be sitting here talking to Hungarians about nationalism. It wasn't part of the agenda. It wasn't part of the dream. It wasn't part of the plan. But it's part of God's plan. And sometimes we have to be a little bit flexible. And then we become something that we didn't know we could become. And that's it. That's the story.
It is not my role, but I feel it as a duty to whisper to you that at this very odd hour of the day, you attracted twice as two times of the usual crowd. So whenever you can come to Budapest, please feel free to pop in. You are always welcome at MCC. Thank you very much. Yep. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.